Thomas Whitmore adjusted his reading glasses as he carefully sorted through the dusty boxes in his attic. At 68 years old, the former palace guard had finally decided to organize the accumulated possessions of a lifetime, prompted by his daughters' gentle insistence that he should deal with all that old stuff before it became her problem. What he thought would be a simple afternoon of sorting had turned into an unexpected journey through decades of memories. The attic of his modest cottage in the Cotswolds held the remnants of his 40-year career protecting the fictional royal family of Aldoria. Boxes of photographs, ceremonial items, personal mementos filled the cramped space, each container representing a different chapter of his life in service to the crown. Thomas had been one of the most trusted guards in the palace, his loyalty and discretion earning him access to areas and information that few others ever saw. As he opened a box labeled 1987 to 1992, Thomas found himself looking at photographs from what many considered the golden years of the Aldorian monarchy. King Edmund III had been at the height of his popularity. Queen Isabella was beloved by the people, and their young children represented hope for the future of the kingdom. Thomas remembered those years fondly, a time when his duties felt meaningful, and the royal family seemed genuinely committed to serving their people. Beneath the photographs, Thomas discovered a manila envelope he didn't remember packing. Envelope was sealed and bore his own handwriting. Personal TW, not to be opened until retirement. His younger self had apparently hidden something important enough to warrant such dramatic instructions, though Thomas couldn't recall what it might contain. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. Thomas could detect the outline of what appeared to be documents and possibly a small recording device. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal knot from age, but from a growing sense that whatever he had hidden away might have been forgotten for good reason. Inside the envelope, Thomas found a collection of documents that made his blood run cold. Financial records, coded communications, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs dating back to the early 1990s. As he examined the materials more closely, a pattern began to emerge that challenged everything he thought he knew about the royal family he had served so faithfully. The documents suggested a level of corruption and secret dealing that went far beyond the normal political maneuvering expected in any monarchy. Names of foreign officials, bank account numbers, and references to special arrangements painted a picture of a royal family that had been selling state secrets and accepting bribes from hostile nations during some of the most critical years in Aldoria's modern history. Thomas sat heavily on an old trunk, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he was seeing. These weren't minor indiscretions or political gray areas. These documents suggested outright treason at the highest levels of government. If they were authentic, they represented a betrayal of everything Thomas had believed in during his decades of loyal service. The most damaging document was a handwritten letter bearing what appeared to be King Edmund's personal seal. The letter outlined a plan to provide military intelligence to the neighboring kingdom of Valeria. In exchange for substantial financial compensation, Thomas remembered the tensions with Valeria during that period, border disputes that had nearly led to armed conflict, diplomatic crises that had cost Aldoria dearly in international standing. A small tape recorder at the bottom of the envelope contained audio that made Thomas's hands shake as he listened. Voices he recognized, including what sounded unmistakably like the late King Edmund, discussing the logistics of transferring sensitive information to foreign agents. The recording quality was poor, but the content was clear enough to be devastating. If it ever became public, Thomas tried to remember why he had collected this evidence and why he had chosen to hide it, rather than report it through proper channels. Slowly, the memories began to return his growing suspicions during the early 1990s. His careful documentation of unusual activities, his discovery that the corruption went far higher than he had initially suspected. He remembered now the impossible position he had found himself in. As a loyal guardsman, his duty was to protect the royal family from all threats, including threats to their reputation and legitimacy. But as a citizen of Aldoria, his duty was to protect the kingdom from all enemies, including enemies who wore crowns and lived in palaces. The decision to hide the evidence rather than expose it had been agonizing. Thomas had convinced himself that the information was too dangerous to reveal, that it would destroy the monarchy and plunge the kingdom into chaos. He had chosen loyalty to the institution over loyalty to the truth, a compromise that had haunted his conscience for decades. But now, 30 years later, the situation was different. King Edmund was dead, Queen Isabella had passed away 5 years ago, and their son King William IV ruled with his wife Queen Catherine. The current royal family had shown no signs of the corruption that had tainted their predecessors. And Thomas had heard rumors that they were actually working to reform the monarchy and increase transparency. Thomas realized that his discovery presented him with a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could destroy the evidence and take the secret to his grave, protecting the memory of the monarchs he had served while ensuring that the truth never came to light. Or he could reveal what he knew, risking the destruction of the monarchy itself, but ensuring that the people of Aldoria finally learned the truth about their former leaders. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force as he sat, surrounded by the remnants of his life and service. Outside his cottage window, the peaceful countryside of his retirement seemed to mock the turmoil churning in his mind. Whatever choice he made would have consequences that reached far beyond his quiet life, affecting the very foundations of the kingdom he had sworn to protect. Thomas gripped the telephone with white knuckles as Sarah Collins continued speaking, her voice carrying the persistent intensity of an investigative journalist who had caught the scent of a major story. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand this might be unexpected, but we have reason to believe you possess information that could be of significant public interest regarding the late King Edmund's reign." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas replied carefully, his years of diplomatic training helping him maintain composure despite his racing heart. "I was just a palace guard. I followed orders and protected the royal family. Nothing more than that." His denial sounded hollow even to his own ears, and he could sense that the reporter wasn't convinced. Sarah's voice softened slightly, taking on the tone of someone who understood she was dealing with a reluctant source. "Mr. Whitmore, I know this is difficult, but we've been investigating financial irregularities from the 1990s, and your name has come up in several contexts. We're not looking to cause trouble for anyone. We just want to understand what really happened during that period." Thomas felt his carefully constructed retirement piece crumbling around him. For 25 years he had believed his secret was safe, buried in an attic along with his other memories of palace life. The idea that other people were asking questions about the same events he had investigated decades ago was both terrifying and strangely validating. "How did you get my number?" Thomas asked, stalling for time while his mind raced through possible responses. "I've been retired for over 2 decades. I'm not involved in palace affairs anymore." His attempt to distance himself from the situation felt weak and unconvincing even as he spoke the words. Sarah's response revealed the thoroughness of her investigation. "We've been following a paper trail of financial transactions that led us to several former palace employees. Your name appeared in security logs from the relevant time period, and we've spoken with other retired guards who mentioned your reputation for being observant about unusual activities." Thomas closed his eyes, understanding that his former colleagues had unknowingly provided pieces of a puzzle that was leading directly to his door. His reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail, qualities that had made him an excellent guard, were now working against him as reporters tried to uncover the truth about events he had hoped to keep buried forever. "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a more urgent tone, "we're going to publish a story about the financial irregularities whether you speak with us or not. The question is whether you want to provide context and perspective, or whether you want to let others tell the story without your input. This is your chance to ensure the truth is told accurately." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Thomas understood that his window of control over the situation was rapidly closing. If journalists were already investigating the financial aspects of King Edmund's corruption, it was only a matter of time before they uncovered the full scope of the royal family's treasonous activities. His evidence might be the missing piece that completed their investigation. Thomas made a decision that surprised himself. "Miss Collins, I appreciate your call, but I'm not prepared to discuss this matter over the telephone. But you're serious about understanding what happened during that period, you'll need to come here in person, and you'll need to come alone. His years of handling sensitive situations had taught him the importance of controlling the environment when dealing with potentially explosive information. There was a pause on the other end of the line as Sarah processed his unexpected invitation. "You're willing to meet with me?" she asked, her excitement barely contained. "When would be convenient? I can drive down this afternoon if that works for you." Thomas looked around his cottage, suddenly seeing it through the eyes of someone who might soon be at the center of a national scandal. His quiet retirement home might become the setting for revelations that could shake the very foundations of the Eldorian monarchy. "Tomorrow morning," he said finally, "at 10 o'clock, come alone, as I said, and be prepared for information that might change your perspective on everything you think you know about our royal family." After hanging up the phone, Thomas returned to the kitchen table where the damning evidence remained, spread out like pieces of a bomb waiting to explode. He had just crossed a line that he couldn't uncross, agreeing to meet with a journalist who was clearly investigating the same events that had tormented his conscience for decades. The afternoon passed in a blur of anxiety and second-guessing as Thomas tried to prepare for a conversation that could change the course of Eldorian history. He found himself pacing from room to room, unable to focus on anything except the magnitude of what he was considering. The evidence before him represented more than just historical curiosity, was proof of betrayal at the highest levels of government. Information that could destroy public faith in the monarchy forever. Thomas spent hours reading through each document again, trying to remember additional details about how he had acquired the information. But the memories were painful, but gradually becoming clearer as he forced himself to relive those difficult years. He remembered the growing sense of unease, the careful observation of unusual patterns, the gradual realization that something was fundamentally wrong with the people he had sworn to protect. As evening approached, Thomas made a decision that would have shocked his younger self. He began making copies of the most important documents, understanding that once he shared this information with Sarah Collins, there would be no controlling where it went or how it was used. The evidence was too significant to remain buried, regardless of the consequences for the monarchy or for his own legacy. The night before the meeting, Thomas barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was about to become the man who brought down the Eldorian monarchy, or the hero who finally exposed the truth. By morning, would have to choose between the loyalty that had defined his entire career and the justice that his conscience demanded. Sarah Collins arrived at Thomas's cottage precisely at 10 o'clock. Her punctuality earning an immediate nod of approval from the former guard, who had spent his career appreciating discipline and reliability. She was younger than her voice had suggested, probably in her early 30s, but her professional demeanor and serious expression indicated someone who understood the gravity of the story she was pursuing. Thomas had spent the morning arranging the evidence on his dining room table in chronological order, creating a timeline that would help Sarah understand how the corruption had developed and escalated over several years. The documents looked even more damning in the clear morning light, their implications seeming to grow more serious with each hour that passed. "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah said, as she settled into the chair Thomas offered, "I want you to know that I understand the difficulty of this situation for you. Investigating people you served loyally can't be easy. But the public has a right to know if their tax money was being used to fund royal corruption." Thomas poured tea for both of them, his hands steadier now that the moment of truth had finally arrived. "Miss Collins," he said carefully, "what I'm about to show you will change everything you think you know about the monarchy during the 1990s. But I need your word that you'll approach this story with the respect it deserves and the caution it requires." Sarah nodded seriously, pulling out a digital recorder and a notebook. "I promise to handle whatever you share with complete professionalism. This isn't about sensationalism. It's about truth and accountability." Her assurance helped Thomas feel slightly more confident about his decision to trust her, with information that could destroy the institution he had spent his life protecting. Thomas began with the financial records, explaining how he had first noticed irregularities in the palace's accounting procedures. "It started with small things," he said, pointing to highlighted entries in a ledger. Payments to consultants who didn't seem to exist, travel expenses that didn't match official royal schedules, and maintenance costs for properties that the palace didn't officially own. Sarah leaned forward, her journalist's instincts immediately. Recognizing the significance of what Thomas was describing, "How did you gain access to financial records? That seems like it would be outside the normal duties of a palace guard." Her question was sharp but not accusatory, showing that she understood the complexity of Thomas's position. "I wasn't supposed to see them," Thomas admitted, his voice heavy with the memory of ethical compromises he had made in pursuit of the truth. "But when you work in a palace for decades, you develop relationships with people throughout the entire organization. The accounting staff trusted me, and when they began to notice irregularities themselves, they quietly asked for my opinion about whether certain activities seemed normal." Thomas explained how his investigation had expanded from financial curiosities to surveillance of actual meetings and communications. "I began to realize that my oath to protect the royal family might require protecting them from themselves," he said. "If King Edmund was involved in activities that could damage the monarchy, then documenting those activities became part of my duty to preserve the institution." The tape recording was the most difficult evidence for Thomas to share. As Sarah listened to the crackling audio of King Edmund discussing intelligence transfers with Valerian agents, Thomas watched her face change from professional interest to genuine shock and dismay. The voices on the recording were discussing national security information as casually as they might talk about the weather. "This is extraordinary," Sarah whispered when the recording ended. "If this is authentic, it represents one of the most serious breaches of national security in Aldorian history. The implications go far beyond simple corruption. This is treason at the highest levels of government." Thomas nodded grimly. "I've had 30 years to think about those implications." The information that King Edmund provided to Valeria gave them significant advantages in border negotiations, trade discussions, and military planning. Decisions that affected thousands of Aldorian citizens were being made based on intelligence that our enemies had purchased from our own royal family. Sarah was taking notes furiously, her trained mind already organizing the information into a coherent narrative that could expose the full scope of the scandal. "Why didn't you report this when it happened?" she asked. "Surely there were official channels for reporting suspected treason, even when it involved the royal family." The question cut to the heart of Thomas's decades-long struggle with conscience and duty. "Who do you report the king to?" he asked simply. "The parliament that serves at his pleasure? The courts that operate under his authority? That swears allegiance to the crown? I was one man with explosive information and no clear path to justice that wouldn't destroy the entire system of government." Thomas explained his reasoning for hiding the evidence rather than exposing it immediately. "I convinced myself that the stability of the kingdom was more important than revealing the truth about one corrupt monarch. King Edmund was already ill, and I believed that his death would end the problem naturally. I thought I could protect the monarchy by keeping the secret until the corruption died with him." Sarah's expression showed understanding mixed with frustration. "But by keeping the secret, you allowed the Valerian government to continue benefiting from their relationship with King Edmund. How many Aldorian citizens suffered because their government was working against their interests?" The accusation stung, because Thomas had asked himself the same question countless times over the years. "I know the moral case for immediate exposure was strong," he said. But I also knew that revealing King Edmund's treason would have destroyed public faith in the monarchy completely. The institution would have collapsed, possibly taking the entire government with it." Thomas shared additional details about the scope of the corruption, including evidence that Queen Isabella had been aware of her husband's activities and had actively participated in covering them up. "She wasn't just a passive observer," he said sadly. "The evidence suggests she helped coordinate some of the communications with Valerian agents and was directly involved in managing the financial arrangements." Sarah's investigation had already uncovered some of the financial irregularities, but Thomas's evidence provided the missing context that explained what the money had been paying for. "We knew about unusual payments from Valerian sources," she said, "but we couldn't establish what services were being provided in exchange. Your evidence proves that state secrets were being sold to foreign powers." As the morning progressed, Thomas found himself feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. The burden of carrying such a monumental secret alone was finally being shared, but he also understood that there was no going back from this moment. Once Sarah published her story, the scandal would consume everything in its path, possibly including the current royal family, who had done nothing wrong except inherit a tainted legacy. "There's one more thing you need to understand," Thomas said, as their meeting neared its conclusion. "The current King William has no knowledge of his father's activities. He and Queen Catherine have been working to reform the monarchy, increase transparency, and rebuild public trust. Whatever story you write needs to distinguish between the guilty dead and the innocent living." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually why this story is so important now. If King William truly wants to reform the monarchy, he needs to know what he's reforming it from. The truth about his father's reign isn't just historical curiosity, it's essential information for building a better future." Thomas realized that Sarah was right. Truth he had hidden for so long wasn't just about the past, it was about giving the current royal family the opportunity to address their ancestors' crimes and prove that they represented a genuine change from the corruption that had nearly destroyed the kingdom. 3 weeks after Sarah Collins published her exposé, Thomas Whitmore stood at his cottage window watching unmarked cars patrol the quiet country lane that had never seen such activity. The story had exploded across Aldoria and beyond, with international media descending on the kingdom like vultures sensing carrion. The headlines were as devastating as Thomas had feared: royal treason exposed, the crown's betrayal, and 30 years of lies. King William IV had responded to the revelations with a dignity that reminded Thomas why he had ultimately trusted Sarah with the truth. Rather than denying the evidence or attacking its source, the young king had appeared on national television within hours of the story's publication, standing beside Queen Catherine in the same throne room where his father had once held court. William had addressed the nation with words that would be remembered for generations. "I cannot change what my father did," the king had said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the crisis. "But I can ensure that his crimes are fully investigated, that reparations are made where possible, and that such betrayals never happen again under my reign. The monarchy will survive this revelation only if we prove worthy of the people's continued trust." The king's response had surprised everyone, including Thomas. Instead of circling the wagons to protect the royal family's reputation, William had immediately ordered a full parliamentary investigation into his father's activities. He had voluntarily opened the palace archives to investigators and had personally contacted the Valerian government to begin discussions about addressing the historical intelligence breaches. Thomas received a handwritten letter from King William 3 days after the story broke. The message was brief but profound. "Mr. Whitmore, your conscience has given our kingdom the chance to heal from wounds it didn't know it carried. Your service to the crown continues even in retirement. With deepest gratitude, William R." The investigation that followed confirmed everything in Thomas's evidence and revealed even more extensive corruption than he had documented. Financial. Forensics experts traced millions of pounds that had flowed from Valerian sources to accounts controlled by the late royal family. Military intelligence analysts confirmed that classified information had indeed been compromised, explaining several strategic setbacks that Aldoria had suffered during the border disputes of the early 1990s. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators examined Queen Isabella's private papers, which had been sealed since her death 5 years earlier. Her detailed diaries revealed that the corruption had been her idea, not her husband's. King Edmund, portrayed in Thomas's evidence as the primary architect of the treasonous scheme, had actually been reluctant to betray his country until his wife convinced him that their royal lifestyle required funding sources beyond traditional palace budgets. Thomas found this revelation particularly difficult to process. Queen Isabella had been beloved by the people, known for her charitable work and gracious public appearances. The idea that she had been the mastermind behind the kingdom's betrayal challenged everything. Thomas thought he understood about the people he had protected for 4 decades, as public protests erupted outside the palace gates. Questioned whether his decision to reveal the truth had been the right one. The monarchy was surviving, but barely, and the social upheaval threatened to tear apart the fabric of Aldorian society. had his conscience demanded too high a price from innocent citizens who were now forced to confront the ugly reality of their former leader's crimes. 6 months after the scandal broke, Thomas found himself in the unexpected position of being both celebrated and reviled across Aldoria. Republican protesters hailed him as a hero who had finally exposed the monarchy's corruption, while loyalists branded him a traitor who had destroyed a beloved institution for personal attention. The truth, as Thomas had learned throughout his life, was rarely as simple as either side wanted to believe. The parliamentary investigation had concluded with a damning report that confirmed every detail of Thomas's evidence while uncovering additional layers of corruption that stretched back even further than the 1990s. The revelation that Queen Isabella had been the primary architect of the treasonous activities had shattered public perception of the people's queen, and forced historians to re-examine decades of royal history through a more critical lens. King William's response to the crisis had been masterful, but the cost had been enormous. The monarchy had survived by embracing radical transparency and submitting to unprecedented parliamentary oversight. William had voluntarily reduced royal privileges, opened palace finances to public scrutiny, and established an independent commission to oversee all royal activities going forward. The crown had retained its symbolic importance, but lost much of its traditional power and mystique. Thomas received constant requests for interviews, book deals, and documentary appearances, all of which he politely declined. Fame had never been his goal, and he understood that his role in the story was finished now that the truth was public. His small cottage had become a pilgrimage site for journalists and history enthusiasts. Forcing him to install security cameras and change his telephone number twice, the personal cost of his decision weighed heavily on Thomas's mind during the long winter months following the revelation. His daughter Emma had initially been proud of her father's courage in exposing the truth, but the constant media attention and public scrutiny had strained their relationship. She worried about his safety and resented the loss of privacy that came with being the daughter of the man who had brought down the monarchs. More troubling were the letters Thomas received from former colleagues in the palace guard, many of whom felt betrayed by his decision to expose secrets they believed should have remained buried forever. Men he had served with for decades, brothers in arms who had shared the same oath of loyalty to the crown, now saw him as a traitor who had violated the fundamental trust that bound them together. The weight of their disapproval was heavier than Thomas had anticipated. These were men whose respect he had earned through years of shared duty and mutual sacrifice, and their sense of betrayal cut deeper than any criticism from strangers. Several former guards had publicly stated that they would never have trusted Thomas with sensitive information if they had known he would eventually share it with journalists. But the most unexpected consequence came in the form of a secret meeting requested by King William himself. Thomas had assumed that his relationship with the royal family was permanently severed, so the invitation to a private audience at the palace came as a complete surprise. The king wanted to thank him personally and to discuss the ongoing reforms that his revelations had made possible. The meeting took place in the same private study where Thomas had once stood guard while King Edmund met with visitors. The irony wasn't lost on either man as they sat across from each other in chairs. Where corruption had once been planned and loyalty had been betrayed, King William looked older than his years, aged by the burden of rebuilding an institution that his father had nearly destroyed. "Mr. Whitmore," the king began, "I want you to know that, despite the pain these revelations have caused, you've given me something invaluable, the truth about what I'm working to change. Every reform we implement, every transparency measure we adopt, is built on the foundation of honesty that your courage provided." Thomas felt tears in his eyes as he listened to the king speak about the future of the monarchy. This young man had inherited a poisoned legacy, but was choosing to transform it rather than defend it. The courage William had shown in facing the truth about his parents' crimes was the same courage Thomas had needed to reveal that truth in the first place. The king's final words stayed with Thomas long after their meeting ended. "You served my father's crown, but you served Aldoria's conscience. History will remember which service was more important." Part 6. Redemption. 2 years after the scandal that had rocked the Aldorian monarchy to its foundations, Thomas Whitmore sat in the same attic where his journey toward truth had begun, but the space felt entirely different now. The boxes that had once held dangerous secrets now contained letters of gratitude from citizens who appreciated his courage, invitations to speak at universities about ethics and duty, and historical documents that scholars wanted to study as part of the official record. The kingdom had not only survived the revelations, but had emerged stronger and more democratic than it had been in generations. King William's reforms had transformed the monarchy from an institution shrouded in mystery and privilege into a transparent symbol of national unity that served at the clear pleasure of the people. Public approval ratings for the royal family, which had plummeted to historic lows during the initial scandal, had rebounded to levels higher than they had been during the supposedly golden years of King Edmund's reign. Thomas had finally accepted an invitation to speak at the Royal Military Academy, addressing young officers about the complex relationship between loyalty and conscience. Standing before cadets who reminded him of his younger self, Thomas tried to explain the difference between blind obedience and principled service. Loyalty to a person is not the same as loyalty to the ideals that person is supposed to represent, he told them. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the one that feels most like betrayal. The speech had been difficult to deliver, but the questions afterward showed Thomas that a new generation of service members understood the importance of his message. These young officers would enter their careers knowing that their highest duty was to the people of Aldoria, not to the personalities who temporarily held power over them. Sarah Collins had won several journalism awards for her reporting on the royal scandal, but she had also faced her own challenges in the aftermath. Death threats from royal loyalists, legal challenges from palace lawyers, and the constant pressure of follow-up stories had taken their toll. She and Thomas had developed an unlikely friendship based on their shared understanding of what it meant to choose truth over comfort. During one of her visits to his cottage, Sarah had asked Thomas whether he regretted his decision to come forward. "Every choice has consequences," he had replied, looking out at the garden where he spent his peaceful mornings. "But I sleep better now than I did when I was carrying that secret alone. The burden of truth is lighter than the burden of lies, even when the truth causes pain." The most meaningful validation of Thomas's choice came from an unexpected source. Prince James, King William's younger brother, had requested a private meeting to thank Thomas for exposing the corruption that had shaped his family's legacy. James, who had been only a child during the events in question, wanted to understand how the revelations had affected the people who had served his family faithfully. "I grew up believing my parents were heroes," James had told Thomas during their emotional conversation. "Learning the truth about their crimes was devastating, but it was also liberating. I can now serve my country without carrying the guilt of their betrayals. You gave me the chance to build my own legacy instead of inheriting their shame." The prince's words helped Thomas understand that his decision had consequences. Beyond political reform and public accountability, the truth had freed the current generation of royals from the burden of unknowingly perpetuating a lie, allowing them to serve with the genuine honor that their predecessors had only pretended to possess. As Thomas approached his 70th birthday, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken in his final years. He had entered retirement expecting to spend his remaining time tending his garden and reading quietly by the fire. Instead, he had become a reluctant symbol of moral courage and a case study in the complex relationship between loyalty and justice. The cottage that had once been his refuge from the complexities of palace life had become a destination for philosophers, its historians, and ethicists who wanted to understand how an ordinary man had found the strength to challenge one of the most powerful institutions in his society. Thomas remained humble about his role in the events, insisting that he had simply done what his conscience demanded when circumstances made neutrality impossible. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sometimes return to his attic and look through the now empty boxes that had once held such dangerous secrets. The space that had been filled with evidence of corruption now held memories of redemption and renewal. The kingdom he had served his entire life was finally worthy of the loyalty he had always wanted to give it. His final journal entry, found after his peaceful death 3 years later, captured the essence of his journey. "I spent 40 years protecting a crown that didn't deserve protection, and then spent my final years protecting a kingdom that did. The difference between those two services taught me everything I needed to know about honor, duty, and the courage required to choose truth over comfort. If there is a legacy to be drawn from my life, let it be this: that loyalty means nothing if it is not grounded in truth, and that truth means everything when it serves justice rather than power. King William ordered that Thomas Whitmore be given a state funeral, an honor typically reserved for royalty and the highest officials of the realm. As the former guard's coffin was carried through the streets of the capital, citizens lined the route to pay their respects to the man who had given them back their faith in their own government. The inscription on his memorial read simply, Thomas Whitmore, Palace Guard, Keeper of Aldoria's Conscience. The monarchy he had both served and transformed continued to flourish under King William's transparent and accountable leadership, proving that institutions built on truth could endure any crisis that threatened them. Thomas's courage had not destroyed the crown, it saved it from itself, ensuring that future generations would inherit a monarchy worthy of their respect and devotion.